Hi everyone, thank you for joining me this afternoon. We're just going to give people a few minutes to join us and we'll just start the webinar a few minutes after 1 o'clock. So I'll be back on air a few minutes after 1 o'clock and we'll get started with the webinar. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to get started with the webinar this afternoon. Thank you for joining me. My name is Saneet and I am from the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. And the webinar today is the third webinar in a 6-part series that will be repeated each month on the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program. So today we'll be looking into how to prepare and submit a successful application package. And the next webinar in this series, the fourth webinar, will be on Friday, this Friday at 1 p.m. EST, and that will be on how to add dependents to an application after you have submitted it to Rocco, and who to contact at what stage. So if you'd like to register for that webinar, the fourth webinar in this series, please go to our website, rstp.ca, click on training and then webinars, and then you'll be able to see all of the webinars in this series. And like I mentioned, this webinar series will be repeated each month until the end of March 2019. So if for whatever reason you've missed a webinar or you'd like to join another webinar at a later date, you can find the schedule for each month, which will be posted up shortly on our website. So in terms of our agenda for today, we're going to start off with an overview of the control panel. We'll look into the application process and who can be included on an application package. We'll look into the new requirements that came into effect on May 1st, 2019. We'll look into supporting documentation. So what documents do sponsors and the refugees being sponsored need to include on an application to ensure that it's complete. And then we'll move on to proof of funds, and then we'll go into the application forms and we'll look into each application form in detail, and we'll mainly be focusing on the new application forms that were released on May 1st, 2018. And then hopefully, if there's time at the end, there'll be some Q&A. So this is the control panel, and hopefully everybody can see it on their window. And this is how you use, or this is how you can interact with me. So using the question box, you can enter a question and it will pop up on my screen. So when we come to the Q&A section, I'll be going through them to answer each one. And you're welcome to do that throughout the course of the webinar. The other option is when we come to the Q&A section, if you have a microphone and voice over IP functionality on your computer, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand button, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question in person. So that's how you can interact with me during the course of this webinar. And if there are any audio issues, or there's any sound issues, or any issues with the slides or the video, please let me know by using the question box as well, and I'll hopefully be able to deal with those issues on the fly. So moving on to the application process. We're going to start off with a brief overview of the application process, and then we'll go into the nuts and bolts of how to prepare and submit an application package. So once the application forms have been completed, and once all of the supporting documentation has been gathered, the application has to be submitted via mail or email to the Resettlement Operations Center in Ottawa, or ROCCO for short. If you are submitting an application via email to ROCCO, it does need to be organized in a certain way. So please visit our website for the specific instructions on email submission, or you can go into the instruction guide for groups of 5 and community sponsors available on IRCC's website, and it will provide you with the same information on how to structure an application for email submission. Once the application is received by ROCCO, and we're going to start off with mailed applications. So for mailed applications, when they're received by ROCCO, an acknowledgement of receipt is sent via email to the individual listed as group member number 1 within 30 days of ROCCO receiving the application. The acknowledgement of receipt is only an acknowledgement that the application has been received by ROCCO, and it does not mean that the application has been verified to ensure that it is complete. The acknowledgement of receipt simply confirms that ROCCO has received the application. And if you submit your application via mail to ROCCO, you should receive that within 30 days of the application being received by ROCCO, and it will be sent, like I mentioned, to the individual listed as group member number 1 on the applications via email. If you submit the application via email to ROCCO, you will receive an automatic auto reply, and that auto reply is confirmation that ROCCO received the application that you sent to them via email. And again, as with the acknowledgement of receipt, the auto reply does not confirm that the application has been verified for completeness. Once the acknowledgement of receipt has been sent or you've received the auto reply, someone at Rocco will then conduct a completeness check. And the completeness check is conducted for both mailed and emailed application. So someone at Rocco will review the application package to ensure that all of the required forms have been submitted and that they have been signed by the group members. As part of the completeness check, Rocco will not verify as to whether all of the required supporting documentation has been submitted with the package. They're only looking to see whether all of the required forms have been included and whether all of the forms have been signed. If all of the required forms have been included and if they've all been signed correctly by the relevant persons, a second acknowledgement of receipt will be sent via email to the individual listed as group member 1, confirming that all of the necessary forms were signed and submitted. The application will then be entered into Rocco's electronic system and a file number or a G number will be generated and sent to the person listed as group member 1 on the application. The file will then be transferred to an officer for decision. So that's if the application is complete. Regardless of whether you submit it via mail or email, you'll receive a second acknowledgement of receipt that confirms that all of the necessary forms were completed and signed correctly, and that the file has been transferred to an officer for processing, and it will also include the file number or the G number. If the application, however, is incomplete, no second acknowledgement of receipt will be sent. If the application was submitted via mail, the application will be returned to the individual listed as group member number 1, explaining the reasons for return and what needs to be done and what corrections need to be made to ensure that the application is complete. For an emailed application, the email will be sent to all group members explaining the reason for return, but the application package will not be returned if you submit it via email. That's why it's very important, regardless of whether you're submitting via mail or email, to keep a copy of the application package, because especially if you're submitting via email and there's an issue with the application, they won't return everything back to you. So if the application is complete and you receive the second acknowledgement of receipt, the file will be transferred to an officer at Rocco for decision. If the officer, upon reviewing the application and the supporting documents, is satisfied that all group members meet the requirements to sponsor and that the group has the settlement and the financial capacity to sponsor, the file will be approved and transferred electronically to the visa office abroad for processing. If the officer is not satisfied that the group has the settlement and financial capacity to sponsor and that they meet the requirements to sponsor, the application will be refused and the decision or the refusal will be communicated to all group members and the principal applicant via email. If the application is refused, the application package will not be returned to the sponsors. Regardless of whether you submit it via mail or email, the application package will not be returned if the application is refused. And this is another reason why it's very important to keep copies of the application package and the supporting documentation, regardless of whether you submit via mail or email. So if there's an issue, if there's a refusal, you can contact us or you can contact your local settlement agency or whoever assisted you with completing the application, and we can work through the application with you to try and identify where the errors were, particularly in cases of rejections, because they will not send the application package back to you. So if the application is complete, it's approved, it's transferred to the visa office overseas for processing. And the visa office will assess the refugee applicant or applicants, if there's more than one, to see if they satisfy the eligibility and admissibility requirements. And this assessment of eligibility and admissibility will be conducted through an interview, a medical check, a security check, and a criminality check. If the refugee applicant or applicants are found to be eligible and admissible, the application will be approved and travel arrangements will be made in cooperation with the International Organization for Migration. Sponsors will be advised of the approval and they should receive a notification of arrival once the travel details have been finalized. If the application is refused by the visa office because the refugees are found to be ineligible or inadmissible to Canada, an email will be sent to the principal applicant and the sponsors on file advising them of the refusal. And again, the application package will not be returned to either the sponsors or the refugee applicants. Like I mentioned, if the application is approved, the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, will assist the visa office with preparing the refugees for travel to Canada. And that includes conducting an orientation with the refugees, making any travel arrangements that are required, issuing travel documents if required, providing assistance with obtaining exit permits if required, and any other further travel assistance that may be required depending on the needs of the refugees. So that's an overview of the application process. And if you do have any questions, please enter them into the question box and I will answer them when we come to the Q&A section. So we're now going to look into who can be included on one application package. And when you are preparing an application package, it's very important to keep in mind who can be included on one package. Because one of the most common reasons for returns that we come across as RSTP is that individuals who do not meet IRCC's definition of a family are included on the same application package. And because the forms weren't completed correctly, because individuals that should not have been included were included, the application is returned. So this is why it's very important to keep in mind who can be included on one application package. And in terms of who can be included, any person who meets IRCC's definition of a family can be included on the same application package. And IRCC defines a family as the following: the principal applicant, the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner, and any dependent children under the age of 22. So this is how IRCC defines a family. So when you're preparing an application package, you'll have the principal applicant, who can be anybody over the age of 18, the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner, and any dependent children under the age of 22. If you're preparing an application package for a family and there are people that do not meet this definition of a family, they need to have a separate application package. So for example, if you have a family of 5, a mother, a father, a 13-year-old son, and a 19-year-old daughter and a 25-year-old daughter, so for that family unit, you will have two separate application packages. You will have one for the mother, the father, the 13-year-old son, and the 19-year-old daughter, and then you would have a separate application package for the 25-year-old daughter. And what you would do is you would link the applications together so they are processed together and that the whole family unit can arrive and travel in Canada together. But it's very important, if you do have individuals that do not meet this definition of a family, please put them on a separate application package and link the applications together. So just a quick note on IRCC's definition of a family: you have the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner, and any dependent children under the age of 22. Dependent children of the principal applicant's dependent child can also be included on the same application package, provided they are under the age of 22. So if the principal applicant has his or her son or daughter on the application package and they're under the age of 22, but that son or daughter also has their own child who is under the age of 22, that child can be included as a dependent of the principal applicant. The dependent child of the PA's spouse or common law partner, provided they are under the age of 22, can also be included. So say, for example, the principal applicant's spouse or common law partner have had a child from a previous marriage or a previous relationship, and that child is under the age of 22, that child can also be included as a dependent of the principal applicant. But anybody outside of that, excluding those two exceptions, has to have a separate application package. As I mentioned earlier, the age to qualify as a principal applicant is 18, and there is currently a moratorium on sponsoring minors that are under the age of 18. And there are two exceptions to that moratorium. One, when the minor, the unaccompanied minor, has a relative or a guardian, and they are listed as a de facto dependent of the relative or the guardian. And the second exception is when the minor or the guardian has a relative in Canada that's willing to assume guardianship on arrival. But apart from those two exceptions, there's a general moratorium on sponsoring unaccompanied or separated minors under the age of 18. Only the principal applicant's eligibility and admissibility are assessed. So we talked about the eligibility and admissibility requirements in the previous webinar in this series, but it's only the principal applicant that needs to be outside their country of origin, only the principal applicant, if they're being sponsored by a group of 5 or a community sponsor, has to have the refugee status document, only the principal applicant that has to demonstrate that they do not have a durable solution available to them. Any dependents that are listed on the application, such as the spouse, common law partner, or any dependent children under the age of 22, they are only assessed on admissibility criteria. So they only have to pass the security, criminality, and the medical check. Just another quick note before we move on from this slide. If there are any children under the age of 22 that are married, they are no longer considered to be dependents, and they need to have a separate application package. And it's very important when you are preparing an application package to please include everybody that meets IRCC's definition of a family on the same application package, because if they're not included on the same application package, they may potentially be barred from coming to Canada under Section 1179D of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. So moving on to de facto dependents. So de facto dependents can be included, and the test for de facto dependency is emotional and or financial dependency between the two parties. So for example, say you have a nephew or a niece whose parents are missing or presumed dead, or they have died, and they are being looked after by their uncle or aunt. The threshold for demonstrating that, or the test for demonstrating that the nephew or the niece is a de facto dependent of the uncle or the aunt, is emotional and or financial dependency. So you need to include evidence and explain why there is emotional and or financial dependency between the two parties. IRCC has advised that it's typically a combination of both emotional and financial dependency between the two parties, but it may just be one. So there's no need to satisfy both. It can be one or the other. IRCC have also advised that unless there is a clear situation or clear evidence of emotional and or financial dependency between the two parties, do not list family members as de facto dependents. If they're over the age of 18, just submit a separate application for them, because the threshold for de facto dependency, i.e. the emotional and or financial test, is very high, and they are expecting evidence and supporting documentation to establish that dependency. So if you do have a de facto dependent, they need a separate application package. So all of the forms need to be completed separately for them, and They also need to have their own refugee status documents. They cannot rely on the refugee status of the principal applicant like a regular dependent would if they're being sponsored by a group of 5 or a community sponsor. You would link the 2 application packages together, and then you would identify the de facto dependent in a cover letter that's included with both applications. So you would include a cover letter with both applications, identifying the de facto dependent and explaining the emotional and or financial dependency between the 2 parties. Previously, or before May 1st, 2018 rather, you needed to identify the de facto dependent on the principal applicant's Schedule 2. In the new Schedule 2, there's no longer a section for the de facto dependent to be identified, so you just submit a separate application package, link the application packages together, and then include a cover letter with both application packages explaining the relationship and identifying the de facto dependent. Important thing to keep in mind is that the de facto dependent, regardless of their age, has to satisfy both eligibility and admissibility criteria. So unlike other family members in IRCC's definition of family that we saw in the previous slide, they do not derive or they cannot rely on the eligibility of the principal applicant. They have to satisfy both eligibility and admissibility criteria. So we're now going to look into the new requirements that came into effect on May 1st, 2018, and then we're going to look into the supporting documentation that must be included for a group of 5 and a community sponsor application, and then we'll look into the new forms. So in terms of the major changes that occurred to the PSR program, and this is specifically from the angle of groups of 5 and community sponsors. So in terms of the major changes that came into effect on May 1st, 2018, they are that all members of a group of 5 and all parties signing the community sponsor forms must complete a criminal record check and must include a copy of the certificate with the application package. A non-vulnerable sector criminality check is sufficient, but the certificate that's issued by the police department that conducts a criminal record check must have been issued within 6 months of the application being submitted. So if you are preparing an application and you know it's going to take some time for you to get all the documents together, prepare the forms, we recommend that the last thing you do is get the police certificate and sign the form. So prepare all the application forms, get all the supporting documentation together, and then get your police certificates and include them with the application just before you submit the application to ROCCO, because that way that you're not playing around with the 6-month expiry date for the police certificates. Specifically for community sponsors now have to include evidence in the application package that the organization exists as a legal entity and that it has some other activities other than refugee sponsorship. So it must have a separate identity other than refugee sponsorship, and the organization cannot have been set up specifically for the purpose of engaging in refugee sponsorship. The next major change is that there's now a stale date for signatures on the combined undertaking and settlement plan. So the combined undertaking and settlement plan, which we'll look into later in this webinar, must be signed and dated no more than 90 days from the date the application is submitted to ROCCO. And that's why we recommend that the last thing you do is sign the application and get your police certificates, because you have to take into account the 90-day validity for signatures, as well as the 6-month validity for police certificates. If an application is returned by ROCCO, you need to ensure that the signature on the undertaking is up to date before you resubmit. So it either needs to still be in that 90-day window, or you may need to re-sign the forms and then before you resubmit the application. The other major change that's happened is that there's been changes in the requirements for proof of funds for both groups of 5 and community sponsors, and we'll look into those in a few slides. And also there is a new sponsorship cost table and a new in-kind deduction table that was released on May 1st, 2018. And we covered the new cost table and the new in-kind deduction table in the previous webinar in this series. But if you would like to look at the new sponsorship cost table and the new in-kind deduction table, we have it available on our website. So please go to rstp.ca, click on resources, information sheets, and then you'll see the latest sponsorship cost table available for download and viewing in an information sheet on our website. So those are the major changes that have happened with regard to Group of 5 and community sponsor applications that came into effect on May 1st, 2018. And we're going to look into more of these changes in a bit more detail when we go through the application forms and go through what needs to be included with a Group of 5 application and what documents need to be included with a community sponsor application. So we're going to start off with an overview of what supporting documents must be included with a Group of 5 application. And these documents are in addition to the application forms. So you have the application forms as one set of documents, and then you have the supporting documentation as a second set of documents. And those two combined make up the application package. So first of all, with Groups of 5, each member of the Group of 5 must include proof of Canadian citizenship, proof that they are a permanent resident of Canada, or proof of their Indian status. And there's a number of ways they can do this. They can either include a copy of their Canadian passport, a copy of their Canadian birth certificate, a copy of their permanent resident card, a copy of their record of landing, or a copy of their confirmation of permanent resident document, or a copy of their Indian status card. As we mentioned on the previous slide, each member from the Group of 5 must include a police certificate and must undergo a criminal record check. And the police certificate must be issued within 6 months of the application being submitted to ROCCO, and a non-vulnerable sector check is sufficient for the process. If applicable, if a sponsor or a member from the sponsoring group does have a criminal conviction, they must show or must include court documents showing that the disposition of any previous convictions, as well as details regarding their sentence. The Group of 5 must also include a copy of the principal applicant's refugee status document. And it's very important that a copy of the refugee status document is included with the application package, because if you're sponsoring as a Group of 5 or a community sponsor and you do not include a copy of the principal applicant's refugee status document, the application will not be processed and it will be returned back to you as incomplete. And if you are unsure as to whether a document will be accepted as a valid refugee status document, please email either myself or one of my colleagues or any member of the team at RSTP, and we can verify that document for you, because IRCC has provided us with examples of accepted and not accepted documents for the majority of countries where refugees are currently located. So we can verify whatever documents you send to us with the bundle that we have, and we can let you know whether it will be accepted or not accepted as proof of refugee status. So very important to include a copy of the principal applicant's refugee status document with the application. And finally, Groups of 5 are required to include proof of funds with the application. And in terms of how a Group of 5 can demonstrate that they have the necessary proof of funds, and this is specifically in line with the requirements that were released on May 1st, 2018, there are two options. Either the funds are held in a trust account or sponsors pledge from their income. The third option is you do a mix of both. So I'm going to go through the requirements for each of those two, and then we'll look into what you need to do if you're doing a mix of both. So starting off with the funds held in trust. So if the funds are held in a bank account, a letter from the financial institution must be included with the application package, and the letter must be dated within the last 6 months. And the letter must state the name of the financial institution that holds the funds, the names of the account holders, and the account needs to be in the name of at least 2 people from the group of 5. It must have the account number on there, the current account balance, the refugee's name, and it must be signed and stamped by an employee of the institution. So that's all of the information that needs to go in the letter that's included with the application package. And if you want more detail with regard to the letter, please look at the Group of 5 instruction guide, and it will specify exactly what information needs to be included. With regard to the bank account itself, it does not need to be a formal trust account. The account can be any basic checkings or savings account in the name of 2 people from the Group of 5. And one of the common inquiries we get with regard to the bank account is that people call us or sponsors call us and they tell us that the bank is not willing to put the name of the refugee on the bank account. There's no need for the name of the refugee to be mentioned in the bank account. So you're not opening up a bank account in the name of the refugee, you're opening up the bank account in the name of 2 people from the Group of 5. The name of the refugee, however, must be mentioned in the letter that is issued by the bank. So in addition to the letter from the bank, the group must include copies of the most recent statements for the account, and they must explain how the funds were gathered on the sponsorship undertaking and settlement plan form. And I'll show you where that goes when we go through the forms in a moment. And IRCC also wants evidence of where or how the funds were gathered. So were the funds gathered through fundraising? Did people donate the money from their savings? IRCC wants to see evidence and documentation that proves how these funds were gathered. So either you include account statements from the Group of 5 members showing transfers into the account that's being used for the refugee sponsorship, or if there was a fundraising event, you include evidence of the fundraising event and how much money people donated. And the reason why they want this evidence is because they want to ensure that the money is not coming from the refugees themselves. Because under the regulations, and it's mentioned in the instruction guide, the refugee that's being sponsored is not expected to contribute to the cost of sponsorship. The money must come from the sponsoring group, and if the money does come from the refugee, the application will be refused. So those are the documents that must be included if the funds are held in a trust account. And just a quick recap, it is 4 separate documents. You have the letter from the bank, you have the most recent account statements, you have an explanation of how the funds were gathered on the forms, and then you have evidence or documentation to show how the funds were gathered. So that's if the funds are being held in a bank account. If the funds are being pledged from the income of the Group of 5, at least 3 sponsors must be employed or self-employed and must have sufficient income to contribute financially to the sponsorship. And those 3 people, it can be more than 3 people, but the minimum is 3. Those 3 people must include a copy of their most recent notice of assessment, or a copy of their T4, or a copy of their T5, or pension statements for the last 12 months if they're receiving a pension, or employment insurance pay stubs for the last 12 months if they're on employment insurance. IRCC will no longer accept letters from employers or pay stubs from employers as proof of income. It has to be a document that is issued by the CRA, so either a notice of assessment, a T4, a T5, pension statements, or employment insurance stubs. And then the final option is you do a mix of both. Say half of the funds are in a bank account, you get those 4 documents required if the funds are held in a bank account, and then the remaining half is coming from the income of at least 3 sponsors, and they will need to include a copy of a document issued by the CRA to demonstrate that they have sufficient funds. So that is how Groups of 5 can demonstrate proof of funds. Moving on to community sponsors and what documents community sponsors need to include as part of the application package. So as I mentioned earlier, as of May 1st, 2018, the organization acting as a community sponsor must include proof that the organization exists as a legal entity with the application package. So if the organization is registered either for profit or not for profit, they can include a copy of their registration documents. If the organization is incorporated, they can include a copy of their articles of incorporation. If the organization is not registered or not incorporated, then they can include a founding document or a document that establishes the organization and a list of the organization's members. The signing authority from the community sponsor plus any co-sponsors on the application must include proof of Canadian citizenship, proof of permanent resident status, or proof of Indian status. And again, this is done through either a copy of a Canadian passport, a copy of a Canadian birth certificate, a copy of the PR card, a copy of the record of landing, a copy of the confirmation of permanent residence document, or a copy of the Indian status card. The signing authority from the community sponsor plus any co-sponsors must also undergo a criminal record check. And same requirements as a group of 5, the non-vulnerable sector check is accepted, and the certificate must have been issued within 6 months of the application being submitted to ROCCO. And if either the signing authority or any co-sponsors do have a criminal background, they are recommended to include court documents showing the disposition of any previous convictions with the application package. And again, community sponsors must include a copy of the principal applicant's refugee status document, and they must also include proof of funds. In terms of how organizations acting as community sponsors can demonstrate that they have the necessary proof of funds, there's been a few changes that came into effect on May 1st, 2018. So under the previous rules, so the rules that were in effect before May 1st, 2018, the organization acting as a community sponsor could pledge the funds from the organization's income. So either from the organization's revenue or from the organization's profit. However, as of May 1st, 2018, the organization acting as a community sponsor or any organizations acting as community sponsors, sorry, let me repeat that again. So as of May 1st, 2018, the organization acting as a community sponsor or any organizations acting as co-sponsors with a community sponsor can no longer pledge funds from their organization's income. There's only 2 ways now for an organization that's acting as a community sponsor to demonstrate that they have the necessary funds for refugee sponsorship. The funds either go into a trust account or a bank account, or if there's an individual that's acting as a co-sponsor on the application, that individual can pledge the funds from their personal income. So starting off with the funds held in the trust account, the same documents are required. So the letter from the bank with all of the same information, copies of the most recent account statements, an explanation of how the funds were gathered on the undertaking form, and I'll show you where that's done in a moment. And they must also include proof or evidence of how the funds were gathered. So that's if the funds are being held in a bank account or a trust account by the community sponsor. And again, the trust account does not need to be in the name of the refugee. It has to be in the name of the organization that is acting as a community sponsor, and a basic checkings or savings account is sufficient. If there is a individual that is acting as a co-sponsor on the application package, that individual may contribute the funds for the sponsorship from their personal income. And as with the group of 5 requirements, they must include a document issued by the CRA that shows that they have sufficient income. So either a notice of assessment or AT4 or AT5, or pension statements for the last 12 months, or employment insurance pay stubs for the last 12 months. So those are the requirements, or the proof of funds requirements, for community sponsors. And just as a reminder, organizations acting as community sponsors or organizations acting as co-sponsors with community sponsors can no longer pledge funds for the sponsorship from the organization's revenue or income. Okay, so that's a brief summary of the documents that need to be included with the application package, and we're now going to go into the new application forms that were released on May 1st, 2018. So we're just going to start off with a brief overview of the new forms, just to lay the context for our discussion going forward, and then we're going to look into each of the new forms, and we'll show you how to complete them. So the new forms were released on May 1st, 2018, and there are now separate application packages for sponsorship agreement holders, groups of 5, and community sponsors. So depending on how you're sponsoring refugees, the forms that you complete as a sponsor will differ depending on the type of sponsoring group. The new forms are dynamic PDF forms, and I'll show you in a moment, but depending on how you're sponsoring, they will do certain calculations for you. And because the forms are now dynamic, they must be typed. IRCC will not accept handwritten forms, and the forms must be completed using Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader. All of the forms for sponsorship agreement holders, groups of 5, and community sponsors have changed. So the forms for the sponsors, all of them have changed. The forms for the refugee applicants, however, only one form has changed, and that form is the Schedule 2. There is a 30-day grace period that started on May 1st, 2018 for using the previous versions of the sponsors forms. So if you are currently working on an application package, or you're partway or almost complete working on an application, and you want to rely on the old requirements or the old forms, you have to get that application package into Rocco, and that application has to be marked as complete and received by May 31st. If you submit an application on or after June 1st using the old application forms for the sponsors, or relying on the previous requirements, the application will be returned to you as unprocessed. So as I mentioned, all the forms for the sponsors have changed, but the only form that has changed for the refugee applicants is Schedule 2. And the grace period for using the old Schedule 2 is until December 31st, 2018. So if you submit an application in 2019, you have to make sure you use the new Schedule 2, but you can continue using the old Schedule 2 up until December 31st, 2018. And again, all forms must be typed because they are dynamic, and they must be completed using Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader. And I'll show you how to download the forms now before we start going through each of the new forms in detail. So I'm just going to exit out of this PowerPoint slide. So the easiest way of finding the forms is if you go to our website, rstp.ca, select your language, either English or French, go to processing, and then click on application forms. So once you go to this page, you'll see that on the left-hand side of the page are the forms that need to be completed by the refugee applicants. On the left-hand side of the page are the forms that need to be completed by the sponsoring group. On the right-hand side of the page are the forms that need to be completed by the refugee applicants. In terms of downloading the forms, if you click on any one of the forms, you will most likely receive or see this page, and it will say, please wait, you need to use the latest version of Adobe Reader. And the reason for that is you cannot open the forms using your browser. You either have to click on the form, and then if you're using Chrome, download the form to your computer, save it to your computer, or alternatively, you can right-click on the form, click Save Link As, and then save the form to your computer. Once you've saved the form to your computer, you right-click on the form, go to Open With, and select Adobe Acrobat or Adobe Reader. And by doing so, you will not see this please wait page that pops up. So please do make sure you download and save the forms to your computer before you open them. There's also a reminder of how to download the forms on this page. So if you click on this link here, how to download the forms, it will explain how to download and save the forms to your computer and what specific programs you need to open them in order to ensure that you do not see the please wait page. Okay, so I've already downloaded the forms, and I'm going to start off with, so we're just going to go through it here. So for the groups of 5, they have a undertaking and settlement plan. So previously it was 2 separate forms. You had one undertaking and one settlement plan. That form has now been combined into one form. And then you have a sponsor assessment and a financial profile form. For community sponsors, the sponsor assessment and financial profile form is the same as the one used for groups of 5. The only different form is the combined undertaking and settlement plan for community sponsors. So I'm going to start off with going through the combined undertaking and settlement plan for groups of 5, and then I'm going to go through the combined undertaking and settlement plan for community sponsors, and then I'll go through the sponsor assessment form, the financial profile form, because those 2 forms are the same for both groups of 5 and community sponsors, and then we'll move on to the refugees applicants forms. So starting off with the undertaking / settlement plan. So hopefully everybody can see the form on my screen at the moment. And this is what the new form looks like. And like I mentioned, it is a dynamic form, and depending on what you enter in certain parts of the form, things later down and sections later or lower in the form will auto-populate for you, and it will do auto calculations for you. So I'm just, for demonstration purposes, going to enter the random or an example group of 5. So I'm just going to call them member 1. And if you click through the form, you'll notice that the email address field is now mandatory. So it won't let you click through and complete the form unless you include a personal email address for each member in the group of 5. So I'm just going to put a mock email address in so we can continue completing the form. And it's very important that a personal email address is included for each member of the group of 5. If somebody doesn't have a personal email address, you must create an email address for them, because IRCC will not process applications for group of 5 members that do not have a personal email address. So I'm just going to go through and complete this very quickly. So hopefully you can see it as I'm completing it on your screen. Okay, and when you are completing this section, one of the new things that's been added where you list the group of 5 members is this box here, where it asks for a unique client identification number. And not everybody will have a UCI number. You will have a UCI number if you've personally had contact with IRCC before. So if you naturalized as a Canadian citizen, or if you submitted a permanent residence application for yourself personally, Only in those situations will you have a UCI number, and then you would just put that number in this box over here. If you don't have one because you've had no previous interaction with IRCC, or if you've lost it, just put not applicable in that box. So we've now listed the members of our group of 5, and each one of them has a personal email address. And that's what goes in on page 1. What this new form allows you to do is it allows you to add more than 5 group members on the same form. So if, for example, you have a group of 7, you can just use these plus and minus buttons on the form here to add entry fields for other members of your group. So there's no need for you to include, on the previous form, you would include a copy of the undertaking, and then page 2 of the undertaking, you would list the names of member 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's no need for you to do that anymore. You can just use these plus or minus buttons to go up and down depending on how many people you have in your group. So we're just going to leave it as a group of 5 for now. In section B, this is where the sponsoring group lists the name and biodata of the refugee applicants, starting off with the principal applicant. So I'm just going to put a name in there for now so we can go through the rest of the form. So this group of 5 is sponsoring Napoleon Bonaparte, indicate their sex, place and country of birth. What it then asks the principal applicant is, do you have additional family members to add? If you tick yes, an additional drop-down box or entry field will appear where you can add the principal applicant's spouse, common law partner, and any dependent children under the age of 22. When you're entering the biodata of dependents, you have to indicate the relationship to the principal applicant. So you have to say, indicate whether they're a spouse, a common law partner, are they a child under the age of 22, are they a child of a dependent child. If you include child 22 or older, a new entry field will appear which will ask you to explain why is this person being included as a dependent. And if you remember when we were talking about how to structure an application package, I mentioned that children 22 or older have to have a separate application package. There is one exception to that rule, and that exception is where a child has a medical or physical or a mental disability which they've had since before they turned 22, and they're now over 22 years of age, but they're dependent on their parents because of that physical or mental disability. So that's the only exception, and that's the only circumstance in which children over the age of 22 can be included on the same application as their parents. And in this explanation box, you would state that they have a disability, which means that they had since before they turned 22, which is why they're being included on the same application package. So I'm just going to list a spouse for now. So I'm going to list Napoleon's wife, the Empress Josephine, and you also have to indicate here whether the dependent is accompanying or non-accompanying. And what IRCC has said is if the dependent would like to travel or has the intention of traveling with the principal applicant to Canada, regardless of whether they're located in a different country, you tick accompanying. If for whatever reason the dependent cannot or does not want to travel with the principal applicant to Canada, you tick non-accompanying, and then they will come under the 1-year window of opportunity, or if the 1-year window passes, they can be sponsored under the family class. But it's very important when you are completing this section of the form to include everybody that meets IRCC's definition of a family member in this section, because if they're not included, they will potentially be barred from coming to Canada under section 1179D of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. When you're adding the biodata of the dependents in, it also gives you the option to include separate contact information for the dependents. So this is particularly useful if a dependent is located in a different country to that of the principal applicant, and including the mailing address or the residential address of the spouse, common law partner, or dependent child under the age of 22, if they're in a different country, will help the visa offices coordinate between the two posts so they can ensure that the refugees arrive in Canada together if they are listed as accompanying. So I'm just going to take no for now. We don't want to have separate contact information. Let's just assume they're together and Empress Josephine is accompanying Napoleon Bonaparte. So section C is where you would link multiple applications. And again, there's plus or minus buttons here that you can use to add or take away entry fields. So if you do have several applications, you just click on the plus button and additional entry fields will appear. If you just have one, you just leave it as one. Section D on page 2, this is where the settlement plan component of the form starts. So everything prior to this section was very reminiscent and pretty much identical to the old undertaking form. From section D onwards, this is where the settlement plan part of the form starts. And the questions are identical or virtually identical to what's on the current settlement or the old settlement plan, but they're just a bit more specific. So for example, the question regarding housing asks for more specific information relating to the housing. There is a new question on here, and that is question 4, and this is for sponsoring groups that are sponsoring refugee families that have non-accompanying family members on the application. So IRCC recognizes that non-accompanying family members, if they're coming under the 1-year window of opportunity, they will most likely not be arriving at the same time as the principal applicant. So IRCC wants you to explain what is your plan for supporting the non-accompanying family member who may arrive a certain number of years after the principal applicant arrives in Canada. So that's a new question in this section that was not on the previous form. Section E, on the previous settlement plan, you just had to indicate what the group will be doing. However, on this new form, IRCC wants a group member assigned to all of these tasks, at least one group member for each of these tasks. So you just enter in the name of each person that will be doing these tasks. And it does have to be at least one person, or it could be more than one group member. And you have to do that for all of the settlement needs outlined here. Section F is the financial assessment. And what it does is, depending on how many people you entered in section B, where you list the refugee, the principal applicant's name, and the names of any accompanying or non-accompanying dependents, it auto-populates this section depending on what you've entered above. So we've entered that this group is sponsoring a family of 2, so it auto-populates the minimum level or the minimum amount of financial support the group has to provide to the refugees when they arrive in Canada. And these figures are based off the new cost table that was released on May 1st, 2018. And the important thing to remember is that the family size or the size of the family you're sponsoring includes both the principal applicant as well as the principal applicant's accompanying and non-accompanying family members. So one of the common inquiries we receive at RSTP is, oh, I'm just going to sponsor the principal applicant for now. I don't want to sponsor the spouse or the children. That is not possible. You must apply to sponsor the whole family unit. And that includes spouse, common law partner, any dependent children under the age of 22, regardless of whether they are accompanying or non-accompanying. And at the time you submit the application to ROCCO, you have to show that you have enough financial resources to support the entire family unit, including accompanying and non-accompanying family members. So when this calculation happens, it takes into account accompanying and non-accompanying family members. So moving down here, I'm just going to zoom out so we can see it a bit more clearly. In this part of section E, this is where the sponsoring group has to start entering the one-time startup costs associated with sponsorship. So I'm just going to put some random figures in here so it lets us, so I can show you how the rest of the form works. So you have to detail the value that's being assigned to furniture, clothes, household effects, linens, school fees, food staples, and hookup costs. So you just enter the figures in here. I'm just going to put a few random figures in. Okay, and then below that, you need to provide details of the ongoing monthly costs. And on the previous form, you had to provide an annual budget, but what IRCC is looking for now is the monthly cost for rent, food, phone, internet, pocket money and allowances, transportation, and any other costs. And depending on what you enter, the annual amount is automatically calculated for you. So it does the calculation for you and it shows you what the annual amount is. So I'm just going to put some random figures in here just so we can see what happens with the auto calculation. Okay, so what it will do automatically, it will take your total annual living costs and add them up for you. It then asks for in-kind deductions. So I'm just going to say that we're doing in-kind deductions for shelter. So I'm going to put 6,900 for shelter, and then it will show you your total deductions. What it then does is it takes your living costs, so the amount of money that you'll be providing for the refugee for their rent, food, phone, internet, pocket money allowance, transportation, subtracts in-kind deductions that you may have entered in this section, and it gives you and it also adds or factors into the amounts that you've entered for startup costs, the one-time startup costs, and it gives you the minimum amount that your group needs to show. And the way it comes to this calculation is it takes the one-time startup costs plus the living cost figures and subtracts any in-kind deductions that may have been listed. So according to the figures that I've entered, this group needs to demonstrate that they either have $20,900 available to them in a trust account, or at least 3 members from the group of 5 can pledge that money from their personal income. If you select or say that the money is held in a trust account, an entry field will appear that asks for an explanation of how the funds were obtained. And it has a reminder here to, in addition to explaining where the funds or how the funds were obtained in this box, the group must submit proof of how the funds were obtained. If the funds are being pledged by the group members, then it goes into the boxes here, and it has to be at least 3 people from the group. Once you've entered all those figures in, it will do a balance that will show whether you have either provided the minimum amount required, whether you are over, or whether you are in the negative. So for example, if my group is under providing, I'm just going to change this, it will show that we have a negative balance of $1,000. That means we're $1,000 below the minimum level of financial support required for this family of 2, according to the new sponsorship cost table, minus any in-kind deductions. If, however, we're in a surplus, so we're well above what's required, it will show, sorry, entered the wrong figure in, it will show that we are in a surplus of $99,000. So that's how the settlement plan is completed. And like I mentioned, it's very dynamic and the form changes depending on what you enter earlier in the form and depending on how many people are contributing to the group, and the entry fields do change, which is why IRCC is not accepting handwritten versions of any forms any longer. When it comes to the obligations, consent, and declarations, a new thing that has been added is this first sentence here. I've just highlighted it, and what it says is that the group are responsible for the principal applicant and all accompanying and non-accompanying family members, including any family members born after the application is submitted to IRCC. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So under the previous rules, if there was a newborn biological child, the sponsoring group would have to add that newborn biological child to the application packages. But under the new rules that came into effect on May 1st, 2018, the newborn biological child is automatically added to the application package. And we'll look into the specific requirements of adding dependents under the new rules in the webinar on Friday. The second thing that's been added to the obligations, consents, and declarations form is this paragraph here. And I've highlighted it so you can see it more clearly. And it's basically a consent to IRCC to providing your contact information to RSTP for the purposes of receiving training and information. And the reason for that is that if you are in the process of submitting an application, we'll receive your contact details and we can reach out to you to conduct a training session, a workshop, or a webinar to help prepare you for the arrival of the refugees. And then the signature page auto-populates depending on the names of the individuals entered. So that's the Group of 5 settlement plan. I know it's a lot of changes and the form is in some respects a lot different to what the previous settlement plan and undertaking was. But we're now going to move on to the combined undertaking and settlement plan for Groups of 5 and community sponsors. And the first part of the form is very much identical to the Groups of 5 section. So I'm not going to complete it like I did with the Groups of 5 form. I'm just going to highlight the main differences because 75% of the form is the same as the Group of 5 combined undertaking and settlement plan. So the text and entry fields again are dynamic, and the date of birth field, which I forgot to highlight in the Group of 5 form, is interactive. So you click on this and it gives you a drop-down menu and you can go backwards and forwards to identify the date of birth. So that's the same for the Group of 5 form as well. So in section A, the contact details of the organization acting as a community sponsor is listed, and the name of the president, CEO, or ED also has to be listed in section A. And then the name of the signing authority from the community sponsor has to be identified. If there are any co-sponsors on the application, either an individual or an organization, you tick yes, and then it will ask you to select the type of co-sponsor. So you select individual, it will allow you to enter the biodata of the individual acting as a community sponsor, and the email address field is mandatory in this form as well. If it's an organization acting as a community sponsor, and because I haven't entered something here, it's not letting me complete the form. So I'm just going to complete that so we can just get through it. So if it's an organization acting as a co-sponsor, the entry fields are slightly different, and it asks you for the signing authority from the organization that is acting as a co-sponsor. So I'm just going to leave that for now because it will impact what the rest of the form will look at. So for the moment, I'm going to leave this organization acting as a co-sponsor with the community sponsor. Section C is the same, so you list the contact details and biodata of the principal applicant. It has the same entry fields for additional family members. You can add or remove them. Allows you to include the separate contact information for family members, as well as indicating whether they're accompanying or non-accompanying, as well as specifying the relationship to the principal applicant. And section D, linked applications. And again, same as a Group of 5 form, you can add or subtract entry fields for the linking of applications under section D. Section E is where the settlement plan component begins on this form. And section E is where the organization acting as a community sponsor provides an overview or a profile of their organization. And the questions are virtually identical to the old settlement plan, but they are a bit more specific, and they are requesting a bit more information with these questions. And one of the main changes is in question 6, where it asks the organization to briefly describe any refugee sponsorship activities that they may have undertaken in the past. And if the organization has engaged in refugee sponsorship in the past, IRCC is requesting that you include the G numbers or the file numbers for those applications. And section F is where the settlement plan continues. And again, the questions are virtually identical to the questions in the new Group of 5 Combined Undertaking and Settlement Plan. It also does have the question regarding non-accompanying family members. So how will the group be providing support to any non-accompanying family members arriving under the 1-year window of opportunity? And then IRCC also wants the group to explain, or the organization acting as a community sponsor, to explain whether they plan on employing or having the refugee volunteer with the organization. And the reason for that is that they want to make sure that organizations are not using refugee sponsorship as a way to get around the regular labor regulations and the regular labor streams that Canada has. So settlement needs checklist in section D. It does differ depending on whether a co-sponsor is listed, and that's why I left a co-sponsor as listed on the application above. You just need to use the tick boxes to indicate who is providing what when it comes to settlement. And again, this financial assessment section is virtually identical to the Group of 5 section. It auto-populates depending on how many refugee applicants are listed, and it provides you with a minimum level of financial support based on the figures in the new sponsorship cost table. This section here is also the same. So one-time startup costs, you enter the figures, you enter the ongoing monthly costs, it does the auto calculation for annual costs for you, you enter any in-kind deductions, and it will do the calculation for you. And when it comes to the funds being held in trust, either it is entered into the funds held in trust column, or you enter it into the personal income contribution column, and the obligations and consents are the same. So you specify whether, you sign accepting responsibility for any newborn biological children born after the application is submitted, and it has the same consent with regard to IRCC releasing information to us, RSTP. And then the signature boxes change depending on how many co-sponsors are listed at the top. The important thing to remember with the community sponsor form is the president, CEO, or ED must sign the form as well as the signing authority. So you must have 2 signatures from the organization acting as a community sponsor, unless of course the signing authority is the same person, it's the president, ED, or the person in charge of the organization. So that's the community sponsor combined undertaking and settlement plan. And like I said, 75% of it is identical to the Group of 5 combined undertaking and settlement plan. It's just the initial few pages regarding the contact information of the organization, as well as the organization profile, which is slightly different. So we're now going to look at the financial profile form. And this form is the same for both Groups of 5 and community sponsors. I'm just going to zoom out slightly so you can see it in a bit more detail. So this is also a new form. And in terms of the major changes to this form, the first major change is question B. So it asks, what is your family size? In the old financial profile form, the question was, for how many people in Canada are you responsible for providing financial support to? That has now changed, and IRCC does not want to know how many people in Canada you're responsible for providing financial support to. They just want to know what is your family size. And if you click on, okay, so if I just put 2 in there for now, it will give you, and if you click on the question mark, it will give you a definition of what a family includes. And it's the same definition that we looked into when we looked into who can be included on a single application package. So as a reminder, you're not listing how many people you're responsible for financially in Canada, you're just listing your family size. When it comes to section C, you tick yes or no, depending on whether you're employed, self-employed, retired, unemployed, or a student. And the entry fields do change depending on what you tick. So if you tick self-employed, it will look different to if you tick employed. And then the other major change that has happened on this form is that you're only required to list your gross annual income when it comes to sources of income, not the net. You have to list gross annual income, and the section regarding previous employer has also been removed. So in the old form, if you'd been in your current job for less than 12 months, there was a section just in between section C and D that asks you to list the contact details of your previous employer. That has also been taken out. So that's a new financial profile form. And again, as a reminder, this needs to be completed by everybody that is committing funds from their personal income. So if it's a group of 5, the minimum of 3 people that are doing so have to complete this form. If it's a community sponsor, then this form is completed by the individual that is acting as a co-sponsor on the application package. So moving on to the sponsor assessment form, before we go on to the refugees forms, I'm just going to zoom out a bit. And this is also a new form, and all members from the group of 5 must complete this form. And if it's a community sponsor, the signing authority plus any co-sponsors must complete the sponsor assessment form. And the form is virtually identical. The only new addition to this form is section L, the disclosure of ineligibility information. So if you tick yes, you basically allow IRCC to share with other members of the group that you have been found ineligible to sponsor if you are ineligible to sponsor. So on the old forms, this consent wasn't present, and what would happen is if somebody from the group of 5 or if a co-sponsor partnering with a community sponsor was found to be ineligible to engage in refugee sponsorship, a generic email was sent to everybody in the group saying 1 or more of your members are not eligible to engage in sponsorship. If you take yes here on the sponsor assessment form, it will specifically identify in that email who was found to be ineligible. If you take no, you'll still get that generic email that states 1 or more of your members was found to be ineligible to the sponsorship. So that's the sponsor assessment form. And I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint slide because we're now going to look into the refugees forms. And like I mentioned earlier, the generic application form for Canada and the Schedule A are still the same. The only new form for the refugee applicants is the Schedule 2. So I'm just going to briefly go over the generic application form and Schedule A, and then we'll look into the new Schedule 2. So this form has not changed, and you're probably very familiar with this form if you've already submitted an application or if you work with other immigration streams. So if there's any errors, they'll be highlighted in red. Once you've completed the form, you have to tick the validate or check the validate box over here, and barcodes will be generated on new pages on this form. From page 4 onwards, you can list the name and bio data of the principal applicant's dependents. And again, you do need to indicate whether they are accompanying or non-accompanying, as well as the relationship to the principal applicant. And as with the combined undertaking and settlement plan, it's very important to include any family members that meet IRCC's definition of a family on this form, because if they're not included on this form, as well as the combined undertaking / settlement plan, they are potentially barred from coming to Canada under section 1179D of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. So Schedule A, so the generic application form is only completed by the principal applicant, and the principal applicant will list any dependents on that form. Schedule A is completed by the principal applicant as well as the principal applicant's spouse, common law partner, or any dependent children aged 18 years or older. So if you have a dependent child that is between 18 but under the age of 22, they need to have their own Schedule A. And Schedule A is where IRCC asks for the personal history of each applicant. So they will look into, or they will ask for information about what the refugee applicants have been doing for the last 10 years, where they've been living for the last 10 years, whether they've engaged in any military service, were they involved in any political parties. And then on the first page of Schedule A, there's also a questionnaire that is the starting point for the admissibility assessment. So it'll ask, like, have you been involved in any groups or organizations that have engaged in war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, terrorism, etc.? Have you been detained, incarcerated? So this is where the personal history of the applicants are captured on the Schedule A. And as a reminder, the principal applicant completes this, as well as the principal applicant's spouse, common law partner, and any dependent children under the age of 22 that are over the age of 18. So Schedule A, again, has not changed. The generic application form has not changed. The new form for the refugee applicants is Schedule 2. So I'm just going to go through it now, and hopefully you can see it on my screen. And again, this is another dynamic form, and the entry text boxes do change depending on how much information has been entered. On the first page of this form, it has a brief description of the eligibility and the admissibility requirements for individuals being sponsored under the PSR program. And this form must be completed by the principal applicant, as well as any spouse, common law partner of the principal applicant, plus any children that are aged between 18 and under the age of 22 that are listed as a dependent on the principal applicant's application form. So Part A is where the narrative goes. And if you're familiar with the previous version of this form, you'll be happy to know that the boxes expand depending on how much information is entered. So there's no need for the applicant's narrative to be included on a separate application. So as you see, I'm entering text and the box automatically expands. And when you print out the form, all the information will be in one box on the form. And that's applicable to all the boxes on this form. So the case narrative, the question is identical to the question on the previous Schedule 2 that asked about case narrative, but it does ask for more specific questions. And the reason for that is to ensure that the applicants are including as much information as possible about the events that caused them to flee or resulted in them fleeing their home country. So one of the new additions is, if the events were generalized, please describe how they affected you personally or what led to you fearing for your safety. So they're looking for more specific information relating to the reasons why the refugees had to leave their home country. There's a new element in question 2C, and that's so question 2C relates to how the refugees left their country of origin and how they got to the current country of asylum. And what IRCC is now asking is, please indicate whether someone planned your travel or helped you leave or enter the country and how much you paid that person. There's no need for the refugee to personally identify that person by name. They just want to know, yes, somebody helped us, we paid them X amount of money. So moving down, so these questions are relatively similar to the old Schedule 2. The new questions, there's a few new questions in Part B, immigration status and settlement abilities. So in Part B, it asks specific questions relating to the settlement of the refugees. So it asks them to identify and use these tick boxes, whether they speak, read, write, or understand English or French, and what their level of proficiency is for each of these categories for both of the languages. And the reason for that is it may help you as sponsors with identifying the settlement needs of the refugee pre-arrival. So if the refugees complete this form and they indicate that they have a high to moderate level of English or French, then perhaps they will not need that much English language or French language classes when they arrive in Canada. If, however, they indicate that they do not speak English or French, or is relatively low level of understanding, reading, writing, or speaking either of those two languages, then you have an indication that they perhaps may need extensive language training when they arrive in Canada. So moving down, continuing with Schedule 2, Part C is a new addition to this form. So if you've worked on other immigration streams, you may be familiar with the additional family information form that is completed where you have to list the personal details of your spouse, common law partner, mother and father. That form has been copied and pasted into Schedule 2. So Part C is where you would list that contact information, and then you would list the contact details of or the biodata of any children, as well as any siblings and any relatives in Canada. What you'll notice is that, and like I mentioned earlier, de facto dependents are no longer identified on this form. You have to include a cover letter with the application identifying the de facto dependent. Schedule 2 also no longer asks the refugee applicants to identify how much money they are bringing to Canada. So there was a question on the old Schedule 2 that asked how much money do you plan on bringing to Canada, and that question has been removed from here, as well as the question that asks them to identify de facto dependents. So that's the new Schedule 2. And sorry, final component, question 13. IRCC wants to know, did somebody assist the applicants with completing the forms, and did the applicant pay that individual for assistance? So that's Schedule 2, and those are all of the new forms that were released on May 1st, 2018. And as a recap, all of the sponsors' forms are new. The only new form for the refugee applicants is the Schedule 2. So I've noticed a few attendees have entered a number of questions in to the question box. So I'm just going to go off the air for the moment to try and go through these questions and try and consolidate them, and then I'll try and answer as many as possible. I realize we have run over time, and I do apologize for that. So I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. I'm just going to go off air for a few moments, and in the meantime, if there are any questions, please enter them into the question box, or alternatively, raise your hand and I can unmute you. And in the meantime, I'm just going to put my contact details on screen. If you do have any questions, you're welcome to contact me after the webinar, or if you're located in another town or another province, you're welcome to contact one of the other trainers that we have in your province or your town or city. And to find the full contact list of all of our staff across Canada, please go to rsdp.ca and you'll be able to find the contact list of our entire team across Canada. So I'm just going to go off the air for a moment to go through the questions, and then I will be back on air shortly to answer as many of the questions as possible. Thank you. Okay, so there's a number of questions that have come through, and I'm going to try to go through every one of them in the next 10 minutes or so. So if I could ask people to stop entering questions into the text box, and if you do have any questions, please call me or email me after the webinar. We have about 25 questions or so that people have asked, and I'm going to try and go through all of them in the next 10 minutes. And again, I do apologize for going over time. In this webinar, there was a lot of content to cover. Okay, so the first question is, would you be able to explain how to process refugees from Israel? The only ID they have is a conditional release temporary residence document with an expiry date for every 3 to 4 months. So with regard to Israel, if you're sponsoring as a group of 5 or a community sponsor, the sponsoring group in Canada needs to complete all of the forms, send them to the refugee applicant. The refugee applicant in Israel will make an appointment with the UNHCR office in Israel, and then they will go through the process of issuing them a letter that states that they are a refugee for the purpose of being sponsored to Canada. To the person that asked that question, if you would like more information on that, please give me a call and I'll be happy to speak to you about the process and give you more information on that. But the sponsoring group in Canada has to complete all the forms, send them to the refugee applicant. The refugee applicant makes an appointment with UNHCR Israel, and then a letter will be issued to them that will be accepted as valid proof of refugee status from Israel. Okay, so the next question is, how do applications get linked? And so like I demonstrated on the combined undertaking and settlement plan, there is a new section that enables you to link applications or multiple applications. Okay, so next question is, I've heard that I can write a cover letter to highlight additional details not covered in the forms. Is there any format for this cover letter? So yes, if there's certain information that isn't captured by the forms, then you can include that information in a cover letter, but there's no specific format for that cover letter. So it can take any form that you would like. There's no specific format for that. Okay, so the next question is, can a de facto child be sponsored on their own, underage, by a relative in Canada, or do they have to be accompanied by an adult? Okay, so I'm slightly confused by the framing of this question because if a child is underage and unaccompanied, by the very fact of being unaccompanied, they're not a de facto dependent of anyone. I think what you're trying to ask is, can an unaccompanied minor be sponsored by themselves without an adult if they have a relative in Canada? And the answer is yes, but it is very difficult to do so because as part of the application process, the visa office will conduct a best interest determination to see if it's in the best interest of the unaccompanied minor for them to be resettled to Canada with this family member. And the visa office will use the United Nations Refugee Agency's guidelines on best interest determinations. And in those guidelines, UNHCR always recommends reunification with parents as much as possible as being in the best interest of the child. So it would be possible, but it would be very difficult. And that is one of the exceptions to the moratorium on sponsoring unaccompanied minors. Okay, so the next question is, does the criminal record check require fingerprinting or is a name check sufficient? In Edmonton, the RCMP, for example, does fingerprinting. Edmonton police do information checks that they search through names. They are both accepted as criminal record checks. So our understanding is either will be accepted. So you can either go through the RCMP with the fingerprinting, or you can go through your municipal police department and get the criminal record check. We're of the understanding that either of those two will be accepted. Okay, so next question is, can you explain the validity of signatures? There's actually a few questions on this, and can you also explain the stale date? So on the combined undertaking and settlement plan, the signature is only valid for 90 days from the date it was signed. So if you sign the application today, the 16th of May, you have to get the application in and submitted to IRCC within the next 90 days. If you submit the application outside of those 90 days, or the application is returned within those 90 days, and you do not resubmit within that 90-day period, then you have to re-sign the forms. That is only applicable, however, to the combined undertaking and settlement plan. There is no expiry date on any of the other forms. So no expiry date on the refugees forms, no expiry dates on the financial profile or the sponsor assessment form. So I hope that clarifies the question. Okay, so next question is, if you're using the old forms and submitting before May 31st, can you please confirm that we do not need criminal record checks? Yes, so the 30-day grace period applies to the new forms that were released on May 1st, 2018, with the exception of Schedule 2, as well as the new requirements that were released on May 1st, 2018. So if you submit your application before May 31st, you can rely on the previous requirements and there's no need for you to include a criminal record check. If you submit the application on or after June 1st, you have to adhere to the new requirements. You have to include a criminal record check and a police certificate. Okay, so next question is, for a copy of the criminal record check, is the vulnerable sector check accepted? Yes, so you can either have a vulnerable sector check or a non-vulnerable sector check. Either will be accepted for the police check and the police certificate. Okay, so the next question is, can you please explain about proof of funds for community sponsors? Yes, so very briefly, if an organization is acting as a community sponsor, they cannot pledge the funds from the organization's income. The organization either has to place the funds into a trust account, or if there is a co-sponsor that is an individual, that individual acting as a co-sponsor can pledge the funds from their personal income. Organizations acting as community sponsors or organizations acting as co-sponsors cannot pledge funds from their revenue or from their income. Okay, so the next question is regarding the grace period. So you said sponsors received a receipt of completeness. So if you submit an application, for example, on May 28th, would that be late? Yes, so you need to have the completeness verification check done. The application needs to be marked as complete before May 31st. If the application is not marked as complete by ROCCO, or if they return it because there's an error and you don't get it back in time, you do have to adhere to the new requirements that were released on May 1st. Okay, so next question. What are the options for community sponsors to get funds if they are not allowed to put funds from their own revenue or income? So the organization can either put the funds into the trust account, or if they're working with a co-sponsor, that's an individual, the funds can come from the individual's personal income. Next question is, what is the timeline for receiving a G number? You said after 1 month we receive the receipt of applications, and after that, how long will it take to receive the confirmation of completeness? So there is no timeline that's provided by ROCCO for how long it will take for the completeness check to be conducted. And the reason for that is depending on volume. It may take, it may be quicker in some periods of the year, it may be a bit slower in other periods of the year. But you should receive the acknowledgement of receipt, the first acknowledgement of receipt, within 30 days of ROCCO receiving the application if you submit the application via mail. If you submit the application via email, you receive the auto reply, which serves as the first acknowledgement of receipt. Next question is, if the principal applicant is illiterate, how can they sign the form? So if the principal applicant is illiterate, they can sign the forms with a thumbprint. So they don't have to necessarily sign the forms by hand. They can use a thumbprint to sign the forms. So there's a few questions regarding recordings. Will the webinar be available for viewing later? Yes, so we will upload the recording to the website. We're not sure on timescale as to when it will be up and available yet, but this webinar and all of the webinars in this series will be repeated each month until the end of March 2019. So you're welcome to join either this webinar, which will be repeated next month, or any other topic in this series. But we will try and upload as many of these recordings as possible to our website. So next question is, can you tell us more about the new form, appointment of representatives in expected community of settlement? Yes, so we'll be covering that form in the next webinar, because that form is only to be used once the application has been submitted to ROCCO. It's not one of the applications that you initially use when you're preparing and submitting an application. That's more of an application form that's used post-submission. So we'll be covering that in the webinar on Friday. Okay, so next question is, the financial profile form, does it apply to a community sponsor? So no, it only applies to members of groups of 5 that are pledging from their funds, or if there is a co-sponsor working, that is an individual that is working with a community sponsor. If it's just a community sponsor and there's no co-sponsors, there's no need for the financial profile form to be completed, because organizations can no longer pledge from their revenue or commit from their income. So next question, if the funds come from the community sponsor's income or fundraising, do we still need to complete the financial profile form? So like I've mentioned a number of times, the funds can no longer be pledged from the community sponsor's income or from the community sponsor's revenue. The community sponsor either places the funds into a trust account, or if there's an individual working with the community sponsor as the co-sponsor, they can pledge the funds from their personal income. Next question is, what if you press the validate button on the generic form prematurely? Can you make the changes, press it again, and get a new barcode? Yes. So if you've completed the form, or you recognize and you press validate and you realize that there's errors in the form and you want to go back and correct it, or you press the validate button prematurely, you can still continue completing the forms or make the corrections or the changes, and then you can just go back and click validate again, and the barcodes will be updated with the new information. Next question is, a de facto dependent should submit a full application regardless of their age? Yes. So even if the de facto dependent is under the age of 18, if they're over the age of 18, if they're listed as a de facto dependent, they have to have a completely separate application package, and that includes all of the forms as well as all of the supporting documentation. So their documentation and forms will be separate from that of the principal applicant. Okay, so next question is, what if the principal applicant dies before arrival to Canada, before or after interview? So under the guidelines that visa offices overseas used for interviewing, it does state that if the principal applicant is not eligible, they are required to assess the eligibility of any dependents that are listed on the application. So if the principal applicant does die either before or after the interview, the visa officer will assess the eligibility and admissibility of the dependents to see if either of them can assume the role of the principal applicant. Okay, so final few questions. Is there any way we can get the list of accepted refugee status documents and non-accepted documents? It is difficult to verify. Unfortunately, the answer is no. So IRCC has already released those documents to us, and we cannot share them beyond our organization. So we can verify documents for you, and we're happy to do so. So please just email us as many documents as you would like, either myself, one of my colleagues, and we'll be happy to verify those documents for you. So I believe, okay, so final question. What if the dependent child that was listed as a dependent because they were under the age of 22 turns over or becomes 22 or older whilst the application is being submitted? Will they still be able to be included as a dependent? So the answer is yes. So the age of the dependents, and particularly dependent children, is locked in at the time the application is submitted to ROCCO. So if you submit an application to ROCCO and the child is under the age of 22, for the purposes of processing the application, they will remain under the age of 22, and they will still be able to be listed as a dependent of the principal applicant. However, if, for example, they turn 22 or older whilst the application is being processed, your sponsoring group may be required to provide additional financial support to them because they are considered to be an adult, depending on the age of majority in your province. So if the age of majority is 18 in your province, you're fine. You still provide the same level of financial support, but if it's a different age and they go above that age whilst the application is being processed, you may need to provide additional financial support because we discussed this in the webinar last week, but at the time the application is submitted to ROCCO, you use the sponsorship cost table and the in-kind deduction table if you're a group of 5 or a community sponsor. However, post-arrival, if you're a group of 5 or a community sponsor, the level of financial support you're expected to provide is based on the resettlement assistance program rates, which may be higher or lower than the figures in the cost table based on composition. And under the resettlement assistance program rates, everybody over the age of 18, or depending on the age of majority in the province, is considered to be an adult. So final question, on the financial profile, when it asks about family size, how about if the spouse is employed, not financially dependent, and not part of this sponsorship? So IRCC just wants to know the size of the family unit. So regardless of whether people are employed, unemployed, students, they just want to know the size of the family unit. So that is all of the questions. And again, thank you for joining me this afternoon. And apologies once again for taking up almost 2 hours of your time. I realize this webinar was scheduled to be just 1 hour, but there was a lot of content to get through. If you do have any questions after this webinar, or if I missed out on your question, please email me or contact any one of my colleagues at RSTP, and we will be happy to help you and provide you with assistance and guidance. Thank you once again, and have a good afternoon.